the first settlements, and the city of Eridu. Imagine this: an endless desert plain, flat as the horizon itself. The sun burns without mercy, the wind carries dust across the open land, and there are no cities, no kings, no armies. There isn't even writing. Humanity has not yet invented history, and yet, this barren land between two restless rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, will soon give birth to the very first civilization. 6,000 years ago, families made their homes here knowing the risk. The rivers could bless them with fertile soil one season and then drown them in another. A single flood could erase a village overnight. A drought could wither crops and starve families. To live here was to gamble against nature itself. The only way forward was to attempt something that had never been done before, to bend rivers to human will. From reeds and mud they built houses. From barley and dates they made food. From temples they made order. And from belief they made gods. In time, these fragile beginnings would grow into cities, and those cities would invent writing, law, kingship, and myth. What you are about to hear is the story of the Sumerians, the people who dragged humanity out of prehistory and into the first age of civilization. The earliest settlements were modest. Imagine a village of 30 or 40 families, its houses clustered around a central open space. Walls are made of sun-dried bricks pressed by hand, stacked in rows, and plastered smooth with mud. Roofs are flat, covered with reeds and clay, strong enough to hold baskets of grain, or even to serve as sleeping platforms on warm summer nights. Courtyards hold grinding stones, clay ovens, and small animal pens. Chickens scatter in the dust, goats bleat, and children run barefoot between homes, their laughter carried on the wind. In these villages, survival is a constant cycle of labor. Men guide cattle, pulling wooden plows across damp fields, carving furrows for barley and wheat. Women pound grain with heavy pestles, mix dough, and bake bread on hot clay. Sheep provide wool, and women spin thread on simple spindles before weaving cloth on wooden looms. Date palms rise at the edges of fields, their fruit a rare sweetness in a diet of bread, stew, and beer. And beer itself is more than drink. It is nourishment, wages, and offering, a liquid tie between human and divine. But there is more to these villages than farming. At the center stands a structure larger than any home, the temple. At first, it is little more than a raised hall, but it commands attention. It is here that families bring their offerings: jars of barley, fish pulled from canals, lambs and goats raised with care. The gods, it is believed, require constant feeding and appeasement. Yet these offerings are not wasted. They are stored, redistributed, consumed by priests and laborers. In the temple's shadow, religion and economy become one. The temple is also a symbol. Its walls are thicker, its roof higher, its entrance marked with columns or painted clay. On festival days, people gather here to watch priests perform rituals. Fires burn on altars. Hymns are chanted in unison. Figurines with wide staring eyes are placed near the shrine, not meant to represent the gods themselves, but the people, forever watching, forever praying. The temple is more than a house of worship. It is the spine of the community, holding together both the sacred and the practical. Archaeologists call this era the Ubaid period, beginning around 5000 BCE. From Eridu in the south to villages near modern-day northern Iraq, communities of farmers and herders are slowly weaving themselves into something larger. Pottery is decorated with simple patterns. Grave goods reveal differences in wealth, and jewelry made of distant stones and shells proves that trade is already flowing across hundreds of miles. Among these settlements, one stands apart: Eridu. To later generations, Eridu is remembered as the very first city, the place where kingship itself descended from heaven. Archaeology tells us why. At Eridu, layer upon layer of temples has been uncovered, 18 in total, each built atop the ruins of the last. The earliest was only a small shrine, but over centuries it grew into a monumental complex. Its final form towered above the plain, a massive structure dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and creation. The temple of Eridu was known as the Abzu, the house of the deep waters. Beneath the earth, the Sumerians believed, flowed the primeval sea, the source of life itself. Enki's temple stood above this unseen ocean, a bridge between human and divine, a reminder that wisdom flowed like water from the depths of the world. A festival day at Eridu might unfold like this. Before dawn, villagers arrive carrying baskets of grain, pots of beer, and small animals for sacrifice. Drums and lyres begin to play as priests light fires on the temple's altars. The smell of roasted meat mixes with incense, filling the air. Pilgrims bow, lifting their hands in prayer. Some leave clay figurines, wide-eyed worshippers meant to stand in eternal devotion before Enki. The rituals serve both gods and people. Sacrifices honor the divine, while the food collected sustains priests, laborers, and the temple's storehouses. But the temple is not only sacred, it is practical power. Its priests direct irrigation, decide when canals are dug, and distribute grain during times of famine. The temple's storerooms are filled with goods: barley, dates, fish, wool. To serve the gods is also to serve the people, and those who manage offerings soon control the lifeblood of the community. At Eridu, the first outlines of government appear, woven seamlessly into religion. Everyday life continues around these centers. Farmers rise at dawn to lead their animals to the fields. The wooden plow scratches furrows into wet soil. Seeds are scattered by hand, then covered lightly with a hoe. Water from the canals floods the fields in slow trickles, soaking into the ground. Women tend to hearths, mixing barley dough, baking bread, and stirring stews with lentils, onions, and herbs. Beer brews in clay jars, left to ferment under woven lids. Children help gather reeds, chase goats, or carry water from wells. Homes are modest but functional. A central courtyard holds cooking fires and grinding stones. Rooms open off the courtyard for storage, sleeping, and weaving. Roofs serve as extra space, especially in summer when families sleep outside to escape the suffocating heat. Animals share the living spaces. Goats, sheep, pigs, and sometimes cattle kept close for safety. The smell of smoke, sweat, and livestock hangs in the air. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, inequality grows. Some families bury their dead with nothing more than a clay pot or a tool. Others are laid to rest with fine painted bowls, jewelry of lapis lazuli, or beads made of shells carried from the Persian Gulf. Status is already shaping identity. Those who control water and temples command more than food, they command power. Mesopotamia itself offers little. No stone, no metal, no strong timber. Yet the people of Eridu and its neighbors crave these resources. And so trade networks stretch outward. Obsidian blades arrive from Anatolia. Copper trickles in from Iran. Lapis lazuli beads, deep blue and rare, are carried from Afghanistan. Shells polished into ornaments come from the Gulf. In exchange, Mesopotamians send wool, grain, fish, and textiles. Boats made of reeds, waterproofed with bitumen, carry goods along rivers and across the Gulf. Donkeys walk in caravans across desert tracks, loaded with sacks of grain or jars of oil. Even in these earliest centuries, Mesopotamia is not isolated. It is the beating heart of a web that spans thousands of miles. To the people of Sumer, the world is alive with gods. The river itself is a god generous, one year wrathful the next. The storm is a god bringing rain or bringing ruin. The moon is a god steady, silent, marking the months. Figurines with clasped hands and enormous eyes are placed in temples, their gaze meant to never end. Priests watch the stars, read omens in animal livers, and mark calendars by the phases of the moon. Life is fragile, unpredictable, and often cruel. But through ritual, the Sumerians believe they can bargain with the forces that control their fate. They offer gifts, recite hymns, and tell stories. Myths of creation, of gods shaping humans from clay to serve them, begin to circulate. These stories are not written yet, but they are remembered, told from parent to child, sung in temples and retold in marketplaces. By around 4000 BCE, Eridu is no longer just a village. It is a city, the first of its kind. Its temple rises like a mountain above the plain, visible for miles. Canals stretch outward, fields spread across the land, and houses cluster in hundreds. It is proof that people can live together in numbers greater than kinship alone can bind. It is the model for every city that will follow. The story of Sumer begins here in villages that became towns, in temples that grew into the first centers of power, and in Eridu, where kingship itself was believed to have descended from heaven. From these beginnings, the path toward Uruk, writing, and the first dynasties is already set. Civilization has begun, fragile but unstoppable. When Eridu was at its height, it seemed to the people of Mesopotamia that no settlement could ever surpass it. Its temple to Enki was vast, its rituals rich, its place in myth secure. Yet on the horizon, another city was stirring. That city was Uruk, and it would become the first true metropolis in human history. By around 3800 BCE, Uruk had grown beyond anything the world had ever seen. Its walls, said by later legend to have been built by the hero king Gilgamesh, stretched for miles. Within them lay not just houses and temples, but a teeming population that may have reached 50,000 or even 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, no city on earth had ever gathered such numbers before. Uruk was not just larger, it was different in kind. It was the prototype for every city that followed, from Babylon to Rome, to the capitals of our modern world. The heart of Uruk was its sacred precincts. The Eanna district, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, sprawled across courtyards, shrines, and altars decorated with mosaics made of clay cones pressed into plaster. Nearby stood the white temple of An, god of the sky, raised high on a platform of mud brick that foreshadowed the great ziggurats of later Mesopotamia. These sacred centers were not only spiritual, they were economic engines. Priests here oversaw offerings, redistributed resources, and recorded transactions. Temples were the first bureaucracies, and their storerooms, the first treasuries. But Uruk's growth demanded something new, a way to keep track of it all. Grain poured in from the countryside, herds of sheep and cattle were counted, jars of oil and beer were distributed to workers, and woolen textiles were shipped to distant lands. Memory alone could no longer keep pace. So the Sumerians created a tool to hold memory outside the human mind. At first, it was simple. Small clay tokens shaped like cones, spheres, or discs, each representing a measure of grain or a herd of animals. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes, marked with impressions. Eventually, the impressions themselves were pressed into clay tablets. Pictures stood for goods, a jar for oil, a sheep for livestock, lines for numbers. Over time, the pictures became stylized, then abstract. By 3200 BCE, the system had transformed into cuneiform, wedge-shaped signs pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. With this invention, humanity entered history. What began as accounting soon became something more. Scribes used clay tablets to record not just numbers, but contracts, hymns, prayers, and myths. The voices of people long dead now reached across millennia. The Sumerians had given humanity the gift of writing, and with it, the power to remember beyond death. Becoming a scribe was no simple task. Children destined for the profession were sent to tablet houses, or adubus, where they spent years copying signs again and again. Mistakes were corrected by scraping clay smooth and starting over. The work was tedious, but the reward immense. A scribe could read the records of temples, draft contracts for merchants, and preserve the words of kings. Literacy was rare, and those who possessed it became indispensable. Alongside writing, another innovation flourished: the cylinder seal. These small carved stones, when rolled over wet clay, left intricate designs. They served as signatures, guarantees of authenticity, and miniature works of art. Some show feasting scenes, others show gods bestowing power on kings, others display rows of animals. To press one's seal into clay was to mark a transaction as binding forever. Thousands have survived, each a tiny window into the world of Sumer. The daily life of Uruk was noisy, crowded, and alive with activity. Farmers drove carts loaded with grain through its gates, paying their taxes in barley and oil. Merchants hawked onions, fish, and bread in crowded markets. Metal workers hammered copper into tools and weapons, while potters turned clay vessels by the hundreds, each identical in size and shape. Weavers clattered looms, producing bolts of woolen cloth that became one of Sumer's chief exports. Children played in alleys, dogs barked, donkeys brayed under their loads. Taverns sold beer, thick and sour, served in clay cups. Families gathered on rooftops in the evening to escape the day's heat, telling stories of gods and heroes under the stars. But city life brought challenges as well. With so many people crammed into close quarters, disease spread quickly, waste collected in open drains. The poor lived in cramped houses of mud brick, while the wealthy enjoyed larger homes with central courtyards. Inequality grew sharper, and for the first time in human history, people could feel anonymous among thousands of strangers. Religion remained the unifying force. Each city had its patron god, and in Uruk it was Inanna. Hymns describe her as both gentle and fierce, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. Festivals in her honor brought the city together in ritual and celebration. Statues with enormous staring eyes were placed in her temple, meant to stand forever in prayer. Priests read omens, marked calendars by the stars, and declared the will of the gods. For the people of Uruk, the divine was never distant. It was present in every harvest, every storm, every victory or defeat. Uruk also gave the world its first great literature. Tales of heroes began to circulate, told in taverns, temples, and marketplaces. Among them was the legend of Gilgamesh, a mighty king of Uruk said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. His epic, recorded centuries later on clay tablets, told of his friendship with Enkidu, his battle with the Bull of Heaven, and his search for immortality. Whether or not Gilgamesh truly lived, his story embodied the values of Sumer: courage, ambition, closeness to the gods, and the eternal struggle against death. War was also part of this world. As city-states multiplied, they clashed over fertile fields and vital canals. Armies marched with spears, axes, and copper helmets. Chariots pulled by donkeys carried elites into battle. Victories were celebrated as proof that one city's god was stronger than another's. One of the earliest recorded conflicts, between Lagash and Umma, was fought over disputed farmland. The stele of the vultures, carved centuries later, shows soldiers marching in formation under the blessing of their god, vultures circling over their fallen enemies. Law began to take shape as well. Clay tablets from this era record disputes settled at city gates by councils of elders or by temple officials. Contracts written in cuneiform bound marriages, loans, and sales. Oaths were sworn by gods, binding agreements beyond mortal life. It was not yet the codified law of Hammurabi, but the principle was clear. Society could be governed not only by memory and custom, but by record and judgment. By the close of the Uruk period around 3000 BCE, the world had changed forever. Villages had become cities, temples had become bureaucracies, and priests had given way to kings. Writing preserved memory, trade linked distant lands, and religion bound communities together. Civilization was no longer an experiment. It was established, powerful, and unstoppable. And yet, with all its achievements, Uruk was fragile. The same rivers that gave life could still destroy. Rival cities waited for their chance to strike. Kings and priests competed for authority. The first age of cities was brilliant but unstable. And it would not be long before the struggle for supremacy reshaped Sumer again. As Uruk thrived, and the memory of Eridu lingered, a new rhythm began to define Sumer. It was no longer only the temple that guided life, but the palace. Out of the shadow of priests emerged rulers who claimed a different kind of authority. They were not only servants of the gods, they were chosen by them. The Sumerians called kingship a gift that had descended from heaven, a divine institution that transformed communities into states and rulers into dynasties. By around 3000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was a patchwork of city-states, each enclosed by walls, each ruled by a king, each dedicated to its own patron deity. Uruk remained vast and powerful, its goddess Inanna presiding over love, war, and fertility. Ur looked to the moon god Nanna. Nippur held the great temple of Enlil, the lord of the winds and fates, considered supreme among the gods. Lagash, Umma, Kish, Lhasa, each city had its own destiny, its own armies, its own ambitions. Life inside these cities was a blend of order and tension. Farmers still bent to their fields, weaving canals through the land. Merchants filled markets with onions, fish, wool, and bread. Priests still stood at temple altars, offering sacrifices to keep the gods content. But above all, this hovered the authority of the king. He was a warrior, a judge, a builder, and a representative of the divine. His duty was to protect his people, expand his territory, and honor the gods who had chosen him. Kingship was wrapped in myth. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later, traced rulers back to a time before the flood, when kings reigned for thousands of years. Gilgamesh of Uruk appears here, his legend transformed into record. These lists were not mere history, they were propaganda, designed to show that kingship was eternal, unbroken, and sanctioned by the heavens. In practice, kings ruled through a combination of charisma, military strength, and religious authority. Their palaces grew into centers of administration, housing scribes, officials, and soldiers. Taxes were collected not only in grain and labor, but also in loyalty, for a king without loyal men could not hold his throne. Temples and palaces worked hand in hand, though sometimes uneasily. Priests claimed the god's authority. Kings claimed the god's favor. Out of this tension grew a system in which religion and politics were inseparable. But kingship brought with it constant conflict. The land between the rivers was fertile but limited. Canals diverted by one city could starve another. Borders were not marked by fences but by contested fields. Disputes over water and farmland often escalated into war. Armies of spearmen marched under the banners of their gods. They carried axes, bows, and round shields of wood and leather. Chariots drawn by donkeys clattered across the plain, carrying nobles into battle. The first recorded war in history was fought between the cities of Lagash and Umma. At stake was a fertile strip of land along their shared border. Both sides claimed it was divinely granted. When negotiations failed, soldiers marched. The conflict lasted years, flaring up again and again, until finally the ruler of Lagash, Eonatum, won a decisive victory. To commemorate it, he carved the Stele of the Vultures, one of the earliest known war monuments. The stone shows lines of soldiers in phalanx formation, shields interlocked, spears thrust forward. Above them, vultures circle with severed heads in their claws. The message was clear. Lagash's god had triumphed, and the land was secured by divine right. War was not only about territory, it was also a way of proving the power of a city's patron deity. Victory meant the gods favored you. Defeat meant they had turned away. Soldiers marched into battle, believing they carried their god with them. Captives were taken as slaves, fields were dedicated to victorious deities, and temples were filled with spoils. To fight was to serve the gods as much as to serve the king. Alongside warfare, law began to take firmer shape. Disputes over land, debts, and contracts were common in a society as complex as Sumer. At city gates, elders gathered to hear cases. Priests and officials recorded judgments on clay tablets. Some of the earliest surviving tablets describe agreements over marriages, loans of barley, or sales of land. Compensation might be paid in grain or livestock. Oaths were sworn by the city's god, binding men to truth under divine penalty. Though not yet codified into a single law code, justice was becoming written, preserved, and enforceable. This was a crucial step. In small villages, memory and reputation had been enough to enforce custom, but in cities of tens of thousands, memory was too fragile. Writing made justice durable. It made promises binding long after witnesses were gone. Amid this growing complexity, inequality deepened. At the top stood kings and priests, commanding armies, managing temples, and claiming divine favor. Below them were officials, scribes, merchants, and skilled craftsmen. Farmers formed the backbone of society, laboring in fields but burdened with taxes and corvée labor service on canals, temples, or city walls. Slaves, often prisoners of war, worked at the bottom, unseen but essential. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, displayed in jewelry of gold and lapis, elaborate weapons, and richly furnished burials. Yet Sumerian life was not all hardship and war. Culture flourished in the temples and palaces. Hymns were composed in praise of gods and kings. Myths were told and retold, explaining the origins of the world, the roles of gods, and the duties of humans. Priests studied the stars, marking calendars and predicting omens. Musicians played lyres and drums at feasts. Storytellers recited tales of heroes and monsters. In these early centuries, the Sumerians created the foundations of literature, music, astronomy, and religion that would shape the ancient world. By 2600 BCE, Sumer was a land of powerful city-states, each proud, each ambitious, each competing for supremacy. Temples towered, palaces flourished, armies marched, and scribes recorded every detail in clay. Civilization had not only begun, it had taken root and grown strong. Yet beneath the surface, instability lingered. Rivalries between cities threatened to tear Sumer apart. Ambitious rulers dreamed not just of holding their own city, but of uniting all of Sumer under one crown. And soon, one of them would try. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumer had grown into a world of bustling cities and proud dynasties. Each city-state was a universe unto itself, walled, fortified, and dedicated to its patron deity. Farmers and laborers poured into cities with their grain and livestock. Scribes filled clay tablets with records. Priests led hymns in towering temples, and kings planned wars, treaties, and monuments to secure their legacy. Civilization was not just surviving, it was flourishing. One of the most profound changes of this period was the emergence of written law. Until now, disputes had been resolved by elders or priests, guided by custom and memory. But as cities grew, so too did the need for consistency. Clay tablets began to carry not only contracts and treaties, but also judgments and precedents. In the city of Ur, a ruler named Ur-Nansha recorded agreements that settled disputes over fields and water. In Lagash, a ruler named Urukagina, a little later, around 2400 BCE, became famous for proclaiming reforms that sought to protect the poor from exploitation. Though these reforms were limited, they reveal something remarkable: the idea that law could be used not only to enforce power, but to regulate it. These were not yet full law codes like Hammurabi's, but they laid the groundwork. A farmer accused of stealing grain might pay restitution in silver or livestock. A man who broke a marriage agreement might compensate the bride's family. Oaths sworn in the name of the city's god were binding, with divine punishment awaiting liars. Justice was becoming systematized, written, and enduring. At the same time, architecture reached new heights, literally. The temples that had once been simple shrines now rose as ziggurats, stepped platforms of mud brick that climbed toward the sky. At their base were courtyards and storerooms, places for offerings and processions. At their summit stood the temple itself, closer to the heavens. These massive structures dominated the skyline, visible for miles across the flat plain. They were symbols of both devotion and authority, reminders that the gods were above all, yet accessible through the service of priests and kings. The building of ziggurats required vast labor. Farmers were conscripted to carry bricks, artisans shaped molds for uniform sizes, and entire communities labored under the Sunday. It was back-breaking work, but it united the city in shared purpose. To ascend the steps of a ziggurat during a festival was to climb not just toward the gods, but into the heart of the community itself. It was also during this age that one of the world's greatest legends took shape: the tale of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. Whether he was a historical ruler or entirely mythical is still debated, but the memory of his reign became larger than life. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved centuries later, reflects themes already alive in this era: the struggle of kings to control their people, the tension between divine destiny and human mortality, and the eternal search for meaning in the face of death. Gilgamesh was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, blessed with strength beyond any man. Yet his people groaned under his rule, for he demanded too much, worked them too hard, and claimed rights that no king should. The gods answered by creating Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, meant to balance Gilgamesh's pride. Their rivalry turned to friendship, and together they undertook great adventures, slaying the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest, killing the bull of heaven, and defying the gods themselves. But when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was left broken, confronted with the truth that even kings cannot escape death. His journey to find immortality ended in failure, but his story endured, a reflection of the hopes and fears of all humanity. Though the epic in its final form comes from later centuries, its roots lie in these early dynasties. Already, kings of Sumer were celebrated in hymns and tales. Already, their deeds were etched into stone and preserved in clay. Already, myth and history were inseparable, woven together into narratives that gave meaning to both victory and loss. Daily life in this era was rich with ritual. Festivals filled the calendar, marking planting, harvest, and religious celebrations. Entire cities gathered in processions, carrying statues of their gods through streets lined with cheering crowds. Musicians played lyres, flutes, and drums. Dancers performed before temples. Priests recited hymns preserved in careful rhythm. Beer flowed freely. And for a day or two, ordinary divisions of class seemed to dissolve in shared devotion. Yet beneath the joy was the weight of obligation. Farmers were taxed not only in grain but in labor. They were required to dig canals, build walls, and serve in armies. Merchants faced levies on their goods. Women spun wool in long hours of weaving to supply both household and temple demands. Life was hard, and while festivals brought relief, inequality remained sharp. The gap between elite and commoner widened with every generation. Still, culture flourished. Schools trained scribes to copy tablets endlessly, preserving hymns, proverbs, and contracts. Some tablets contained student exercises, clumsy signs, mistakes corrected, insults scratched in the margins, proof that even in the world's first schools, students were still students. Artisans crafted jewelry of gold and lapis, carved statues of gods with inlaid eyes, and painted pottery with intricate designs. Musicians composed songs, and poets recited tales that blended myth, morality, and memory. By 2500 BCE, Sumer had become a land of dynasties, laws, temples, and legends. Its kings built walls and canals, its priests raised ziggurats, its scribes wrote in clay, and its poets gave humanity its first great epic. Civilization was no longer fragile. It was established, powerful, and deeply rooted. But the ambitions of kings were growing. No longer satisfied with ruling a single city, they dreamed of uniting all of Sumer under one throne. That dream of empire would soon be realized. To understand the impact of Sargon's rule, we have to descend from the lofty declarations of kings into the streets, fields, and homes of his empire. For the ordinary farmer in a village outside Sargon's rise meant new governors, new officials, and sometimes new taxes. Grain was no longer owed only to the local temple. It was counted, weighed, and redistributed across the empire. Clay tablets record lists of rations, tallies of barley, and shipments sent from one province to another. What had once been a local economy became a network, tied together by Akkadian administrators who expected accountability. Merchants found themselves in a new golden age. Under Sargon, caravans stretched farther than ever before. Donkeys carried lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan. Ships sailed down the Persian Gulf, bringing copper and pearls from Oman. Cedarwood came from Lebanon, prized for its strength and fragrance. Markets in Akkadian cities filled with goods that had never been seen before. Silver from Anatolia, carnelian beads from the Indus Valley, fine textiles dyed in colors beyond the reach of ordinary households. For those who could navigate its roads and risks, empire meant opportunity. Scribes too thrived. Akkadian became the language of administration, but Sumerian remained the tongue of sacred hymns, myths, and rituals. Schools doubled their work, teaching students to copy both. Some tablets preserve practice exercises, lists of Sumerian words with Akkadian translations beside them, the world's first bilingual dictionaries. The fusion of traditions did not erase the old, but layered the new upon it. This cultural blending would echo long after Akkad itself fell. Religion under Sargon reflected this same duality. He paid homage to Sumerian gods, Enlil of Nippur, Enki of Eridu, Nana of while elevating Akkadian deities like Ishtar to new prominence. Processions through the streets became even grander, with statues of gods paraded not just for one city, but as symbols of unity across the empire. In hymns, Sargon is described as chosen by Ishtar, the warrior goddess who granted him victory after victory. By tying his reign to her, Sargon gave divine justification to his conquests. The empire was also a military machine. Garrison tablets record rations for soldiers stationed far from home. Many were young men from conquered cities, pressed into service under Akkadian generals. Campaigns could last months, even years, marching across deserts and mountains. Discipline was strict. Desertion meant death. Yet for those who served loyally, there were rewards, plunder, rations, and sometimes land grants in newly subdued territories. The symbolism of empire appeared everywhere. Inscriptions carved into stone and stamped onto bricks bore Sargon's titles: King of Kish, King of Akkad, King of the Four Quarters of the World. Seals bore images of victorious kings trampling enemies, gods granting legitimacy with outstretched hands, and soldiers in tight formation. Even the landscape was reshaped. Canals linked distant rivers, fortresses dotted the frontiers, and new roads stitched together lands that had never before been bound to a single ruler. But holding such a realm was never easy. The further his power reached, the more fragile it became. Governors in distant cities grew ambitious, tempted by the wealth that passed through their hands. Conquered peoples remembered their independence bitterly. Rebellions flared, and though Sargon crushed them, each left scars. The Akkadian administration grew ever more complex, demanding more scribes, more soldiers, more grain, straining the loyalty of those who labored at the bottom. Even nature conspired to test the empire. Droughts and shifting river courses could devastate harvests, sparking famine in one city while abundance remained in another. When supplies failed, rebellions spread more quickly. To rule an empire was to fight not just armies, but the unpredictable will of the land itself. Yet through all of this, Sargon endured. His reign lasted more than 50 years, an extraordinary span in an age when kings often fell by assassination or revolt. By the time of his death, his name was legend, carried in hymns, remembered in proverbs, inscribed on tablets across the known world. His dynasty was secure for now. For the people of Sumer, the age of independent city-states had passed. Life was no longer defined only by one city, but by the empire as a whole. A farmer in Ur, a merchant in Akkad, a scribe in Nippur, a soldier on the frontier, all now lived under the shadow of one man's ambition. The world had changed. History had taken a leap. And though the Akkadian Empire would one day crumble, the idea it created that one ruler could unite vast lands and peoples under a single crown would never vanish. The first empire had been born. When Sargon died, his dynasty was secure, but the strain of empire already weighed on his successors. His sons, Rimush and Manishtushu, inherited not only vast lands, but endless rebellions. Both ruled briefly, fighting desperately to keep the empire intact. Rimush put down revolts in Sumer but was murdered by his own court. Manishtushu led campaigns abroad but also fell to assassination. For a moment, it seemed the empire would collapse as quickly as it had risen. But then came Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, who would take Akkad to its greatest heights. His reign, beginning around 2254 BCE, was a blaze of ambition. Where Sargon had claimed to be king of the world, Naram Sin declared himself king of the four quarters of the universe. Where earlier kings ruled as servants of the gods, Naram Sin went further. He proclaimed himself a god king, the first in Mesopotamian history. This was shocking. Kings were chosen by gods, but they were not divine themselves. Naram Sin broke tradition by having his name written with the divine determinative, the cuneiform sign reserved for deities. His statues showed him with the horned crown of divinity. To his followers, this was a mark of destiny. To his critics, it was arrogance. Either way, It set him apart as a ruler of unmatched ambition. His greatest triumph was the conquest of the Lulubi, mountain tribes to the east, a famous stone relief, now in the Louvre, depicts the scene. Naram-Sin stands taller than his soldiers, climbing a mountain beneath blazing stars, arrows piercing his enemies, while terrified warriors beg for mercy. His horned crown gleams, his spear strikes, and around him the Akkadian army marches in ordered ranks. The message is unmistakable. The king is not merely mortal. He is cosmic, eternal, chosen to dominate. Under Naram-Sin, the empire expanded farther than ever before. Campaigns reached into Anatolia and the Zagros, crushing cities that resisted Akkadian control. Trade routes stretched across deserts and mountains, bringing in gold, silver, copper, timber, and stone. Akkadian culture flourished. Scribes copied hymns and royal inscriptions. Administrators kept order in distant provinces, and monuments proclaimed the dynasty's divine right to rule. But the very scale of this empire carried the seeds of its undoing. Conquered cities grew restless. Governors grew ambitious. Armies were stretched thin across thousands of miles. And then, nature itself turned against Akkad. Clay tablets from later centuries describe it simply. For 7 years, no grain grew. The people ate grass. They ate their children. Archaeological evidence suggests a severe drought struck Mesopotamia around this time, shrinking harvests and drying canals. Without food, cities starved. Without surplus, soldiers could not be fed. The empire that had seemed invincible began to fracture. Rebellions erupted across Sumer. Cities that had once bowed to Akkad now rose in defiance. Uruk, and Lagash declared independence, tearing down imperial statues, erasing inscriptions, and restoring their own local kings. Naram-Sin fought desperately to put down these revolts, and at times he succeeded, but each victory left new wounds, and each suppression bred new hatred. As if this were not enough, invaders came from the mountains. The Gutians, tribes from the Zagros, whose raids grew bolder as Akkad weakened. To later Mesopotamians, the Gutians were remembered as destroyers, people who know not grain nor writing, who cannot build houses, who live like dogs in the mountains. Whether exaggeration or truth, they became symbols of chaos. The antithesis of civilization, the Gutians swept into Mesopotamia, plundering cities, disrupting trade, and toppling Akkadian control. For decades, they ravaged the land, leaving famine and instability in their wake. Naram-Sin's successors tried to resist, but the empire's structure was collapsing. Governors declared independence, provinces broke away, and the proud city of Akkad itself was eventually abandoned, its location lost forever beneath the sands. Later scribes remembered Akkad's fall as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's arrogance. By calling himself a god, they said, he had angered the great gods of heaven, who sent famine and invaders to humble him. Whether myth or memory, the story reflects a truth. When kings overreach, empires crumble. By the end of the 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian Empire was gone. Its monuments lay in ruins, its cities burned, its records scattered, yet its legacy endured. The idea of empire, of one ruler over many lands, would never vanish from Mesopotamia. Kings of later centuries would look back to Sargon and Naram-Sin as models of ambition and warnings of hubris. The Sumerians, battered but unbroken, would soon rise again under new dynasties. But the shadow of Akkad remained, a reminder that even the mightiest empire can fall. For nearly a century, After the fall of Akkad, Mesopotamia lay fractured. The Gutians roamed the plains, raiding towns and disrupting trade. Sumerian city-states struggled to regain their independence, but were too divided to restore lasting order. Farmers abandoned their fields, canals fell into disrepair, and famine haunted the land. To later generations, this time was remembered as a dark age, when civilization itself seemed on the brink of vanishing. And then, slowly, the tide began to turn. In the city of one of the most ancient of Sumerian centers, a line of rulers rose who would restore stability, rebuild the land, and revive the old glory of Sumer. This was the third dynasty of known today as III, and its kings would preside over what many call the Sumerian Renaissance. The founder was Namu, who seized power around 2112 BCE. Unlike Sargon, who had risen from obscurity, Namu came from a Sumerian noble family, deeply rooted in tradition. He inherited a world still scarred by Gutian raids, but also one ready for order. With shrewd leadership and military skill, he drove the Gutians out of the heartland, reclaiming the fields and canals that had once sustained Mesopotamian life. His victory was celebrated as the return of civilization itself. But Namu's legacy was not just military. He issued what is considered the world's first written law code. Fragments of clay tablets survive, describing laws that covered theft, false accusations, marriage, and property disputes. Penalties were often fines in silver, scaled according to the offense, while later codes, like Hammurabi's, are more famous. Namu's laws set the precedent. Justice was to be consistent, written, and preserved for all to see. In this, the Sumerians reclaimed their place as pioneers of order. Namu also began ambitious building projects. At he constructed a massive ziggurat, one of the most iconic in Mesopotamian history. Its base was a rectangle of mud brick, its terraces stacked higher and higher, with stairways rising to the heavens. At its summit stood a temple to Nana, the moon god, patron of This ziggurat was more than architecture, it was a statement. The gods had returned, order was restored, and Sumer was alive again. Administration under III became highly sophisticated. Thousands of tablets survive from this period, detailing everything from tax collections to livestock counts, labor rosters to temple offerings. The bureaucracy of reached into every village and field, recording harvests, redistributing grain, and ensuring the flow of resources to temples, armies, and palaces. Scribes were everywhere, their styluses scratching lines into wet clay late into the night. For historians today, this avalanche of records offers one of the clearest pictures of daily life in the ancient world. Life for ordinary people slowly stabilized. Farmers once again tilled irrigated fields of barley and wheat. Shepherds drove herds of sheep and goats across the plains, their wool woven into fine textiles. Traders carried goods along the revived routes, from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. Artisans produced jewelry, statues, and pottery in workshops, humming with activity. Cities bustled once more, their streets filled with vendors, priests, soldiers, and scribes. Namu's successors built on his achievements. His son, Shulgi, reigned for nearly half a century, expanding the empire and deepening its institutions. Shulgi was a master of propaganda, presenting himself as warrior, builder, lawgiver, and even poet. He boasted of running great distances, defeating enemies, and composing hymns to the gods. Under his reign, the empire of reached its greatest extent, stretching across Sumer and Akkad, into Elam, and across much of Mesopotamia. But even as III flourished, challenges remained. The empire demanded heavy labor and taxes, and resentment brewed in outlying regions. The administrative system, while effective, was rigid, sometimes crushing local initiative under mountains of bureaucracy. And beyond the empire's borders, new peoples were stirring Amorite tribes pressing in from the west, Elamites waiting in the east. For now, Sumer enjoyed a final age of strength. Temples gleamed with offerings. Ziggurats towered above the plains. Scribes filled archives with records, and kings proclaimed their glory in hymns and monuments. After centuries of war and collapse, the land of Sumer stood tall once more, defiant against time, radiant in its last great flowering. When Shulgi died, he left behind not only a vast empire, but also a carefully cultivated image of greatness. He had declared himself divine, composed hymns in his own honor, and boasted of his wisdom, speed, and strength. In one inscription, he claims to have run from Nippur to over 100 miles in a single day, a feat more symbolic than real. His propaganda painted him as a superhuman ruler, a king ordained by the gods to maintain order across the world. But behind the glowing words, the empire was already straining. The very bureaucracy that had made Ur-3 powerful had grown suffocating. Every field, every sheep, every jar of grain was tracked on clay tablets. Officials tallied harvests, recorded labor, and demanded taxes with relentless precision. Thousands of scribes worked in administrative offices, their styluses scratching late into the night, filling archives with endless records. For historians today, this is a treasure trove, but for the people of the time, it could feel like a burden that never lifted. Villages were required to send laborers to maintain canals, roads, and temples. Farmers had to surrender fixed quotas of grain, even in years when floods or drought reduced yields. Merchants faced levies at checkpoints. Soldiers were conscripted for campaigns in distant lands. Life under Ur's system was orderly, but it was also heavy, and resentment began to spread in provinces far from the capital. The successors of Shulgi Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin inherited a machine that ran smoothly on paper, but faltered in practice. Amarsin tried to continue his father's policies, expanding campaigns into Elam and reinforcing the empire's frontiers. Shusin, facing increasing pressure from the Amorites, even built a massive defensive wall across the northern border, sometimes called the Wall of Martu. But walls cannot stop migrations forever. The Amorites, drawn by fertile fields and weakened defenses, slipped through, settling near cities and slowly eroding the empire's control. Meanwhile, the Elamites to the east were growing stronger. They had long been rivals of Mesopotamia, but now, with Ur weakened, they saw opportunity. Their armies raided deeper and deeper into the plains, carrying off loot and prisoners. Each raid was a wound, and the empire's ability to respond diminished year by year. By the reign of Ibisin, the final king of Ur-3, the empire was unraveling. Tablets from governors paint a picture of despair. One writes that famine has struck his province and begs for grain. Another warns of Amorite incursions. A third reports that peasants are abandoning their fields, fleeing hunger and taxes. Ibisin responded with decrees, but his reach no longer extended beyond Ur's walls. The final blow came with the Elamite invasion. Marching westward, they besieged Ur. For months, the city endured, but famine gnawed at its people. Desperate inscriptions record pleas to the gods for deliverance, but none came. At last, the walls were breached. The ziggurat of Nana, once the symbol of Ur's revival, was plundered and set aflame. Treasures of silver and gold, accumulated over centuries, were carried off. Priests were slaughtered, and the king himself was captured, dragged into exile in Elam. The devastation seared itself into memory. Sumerian poets composed laments unlike anything the world had seen before: the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, the lament for Sumer and Ur. These were not triumphant hymns or royal boasts. They were cries of grief. They described temples abandoned by their gods, people weeping in the streets, the city itself speaking in sorrow. Its people groan, its walls are breached, its treasures scattered. These laments are among the earliest examples of tragic literature works that face loss, suffering, and yet, even as political power slipped away, the cultural legacy of Sumer endured. The Sumerian language, though no longer spoken, remained the sacred language of scribes and priests, studied and preserved for centuries. Babylonian and Assyrian scholars copied Sumerian texts, recited Sumerian hymns, and wrote their own works in imitation of Sumerian style. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first composed in Sumerian, was expanded into Akkadian, becoming the great epic of Mesopotamia. Ideas born in Sumer, the concept of kingship, written law, the wheel, the plough, monumental architecture, organized religion became the foundation upon which later civilizations built. Babylon would rise next, then Assyria, then Persia, Greece, and Rome. Each carried echoes of Sumer, often without knowing the name of the people who had first shaped the world. So the story of Sumer does not end in flames alone. Yes, Ur was sacked, its ziggurat blackened, its king humbled. But in another sense, Sumer never died. It lives in every tablet copied by Babylonian scribes, in every code of law, in every myth retold, in every city built upon a plan first imagined by Sumerian hands. The cradle of civilization did not cradle forever, but what it nurtured, writing, cities, law, epic, worship, spread far beyond the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Sumerians lit a fire that time could never extinguish.